The whisper was so quiet it was almost part of the stairwell's hum, the sound of air moving through a concrete lung.
Sir.
She's been sleeping here, David, the night guard, kept his voice low, his gaze fixed not on the man beside him but on the form huddled on the landing below. The man, Mr. Takeda, said nothing. His stillness was a kind of gravity. It pulled the air tight around him. He wore a suit the color of a rainy sky, tailored so precisely it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. He descended 2 steps, his leather shoes making no sound on the poured concrete. From this new vantage, he could see her more clearly. A young woman, curled into the corner where the wall met the steps, using a thick textbook as a pillow. Her backpack was tucked neatly against her side, the zipper closed. Beside her, a silver foil blanket, the kind given to marathon runners, was folded into a perfect, tight square. She wasn't sprawled. She occupied the smallest possible space, a study in self-containment. Her face, turned toward the wall, was calm in sleep. An open organic chemistry textbook lay across her lap, a yellow highlighter resting in the crease of the pages. Mr. Takeda's eyes took in the details with an unnerving placidity. The worn-down soles of her sneakers, the slight fraying on the strap of her backpack, the way her fingers were curled loosely around the highlighter, as if she had drifted off mid-sentence. He saw not chaos, but order under duress. David shifted his weight, the jingle of his keys a nervous punctuation in the silence. "Third night I've seen her. She's gone by 5 a.m. Doesn't make a mess." He was defending her, and he wasn't sure why. Mr. Takeda finally looked at him. His eyes were dark and still, and they held no judgment, only a deep, unsettling attentiveness. "She is a student," he said. It was not a question. It was an observation stated as fact. "I think so, sir." The book, Mr. Takeda took another silent step down. He could see the title now, Principles of Biochemistry. He noted the university logo on the corner of her worn sweatshirt. He looked at her hands again.
No rings, no polished nails.
Just capable hands, one of which bore a faint, faded scar across the knuckles. They were hands that worked. He remained there for a full minute, an observer in a quiet, concrete gallery, before turning and ascending the stairs. He paused beside the guard. "Leave her," he said, the words as spare and final as a closed door. David nodded, watching the man's immaculate silhouette disappear through the fire door at the top of the landing, the heavy thump of its closing echoing down the empty stairwell. Below, the young woman slept on, unaware of the silent judgment that had just been passed and suspended. Annalise woke before her alarm, a skill honed by necessity. The internal clock, wired to fear and adrenaline, was more reliable than any device. For a moment, she was suspended in the disorienting space between sleep and awareness, the rough texture of the textbook cover against her cheek the first anchor to reality. The stairwell.
Right.
The air was cold, carrying the metallic tang of dust and circulated air. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff. A deep ache settled into her right hip from its contact with the concrete floor. The first rule was efficiency.
No wasted movements.
She capped the highlighter and placed it in the side pocket of her backpack. The textbook went in next, its weight a familiar burden. She folded the foil blanket with the precision of a soldier packing a parachute, smoothing out the wrinkles, tucking the corners, until it was a dense silver rectangle that fit perfectly into the front pouch. She was a ghost in this building of glass and steel. She left no trace. Her presence was a whisper, easily erased by the morning cleaning crew. She checked her phone. 4:47 a.m. Time to move. She shouldered her pack, the straps digging into her clavicle, and began the climb. 28 floors. It was better than the gym membership she could no longer afford. At the top, she pushed open the fire door and slipped into the silent, carpeted hallway of the 30th floor, a world away from the concrete well where she slept. She walked to the women's restroom, the motion-activated lights flickering on to reveal a cavern of polished marble and chrome. Inside a stall, she undressed and began the meticulous process of her morning routine with a pack of wet wipes and a travel-sized bottle of soap. It was a humiliating, delicate dance, a fight to maintain a perimeter of dignity against an encroaching tide of despair. She brushed her teeth with a bottle of water, spitting carefully into the toilet. She changed into a clean shirt she kept folded in a plastic bag. Looking in the mirror, she saw the faint purple smudges under her eyes, the slight hollowness in her cheeks. But she also saw the set of her jaw. She pulled her hair back into a tight bun, splashed cold water on her face, and when she looked again, she saw not a homeless girl, but a pre-med student ready for her 8 a.m. lecture. She was out of the building by 5:15, melting into the pre-dawn gray of the city, just another student with a heavy backpack and a long day ahead. The memory of the lock clicking shut for the final time was a physical sensation she could still feel in her teeth. Mr. Roth, her landlord, hadn't been cruel. His indifference was far worse. He had stood in the hallway, his arms crossed, while the sheriff's deputy, a man with tired eyes, oversaw the removal of her belongings to the curb. "It's just business, Annalise," Roth had said, his voice flat, as if explaining a simple equation. "You don't pay, you don't stay." He had her security deposit and the last month's rent she'd paid up front, but the part-time library job hadn't been enough to cover the third month after her hours were cut. She had begged for 2 more weeks, just until her student loan disbursement came through. He'd looked straight through her. That was the moment she understood how systems worked. They were not emotional. They were a series of switches, and for her, a switch had been flipped to off. Now, her world was contained in a 60-liter backpack and a single locker at the university gym. Everything else, her mother's old armchair, the small pot of basil she'd tried to keep alive, the framed photo from her high school graduation, was gone. Sitting in the back of the lecture hall, she typed notes furiously, the clatter of her keyboard a small act of defiance. The professor was explaining cellular respiration, the intricate process of converting glucose into ADP, the body's energy currency. Annalise understood this on a visceral level. She was running on reserves, converting every scrap of opportunity into the energy required to simply keep going. Her focus was a shield. As long as she could understand the Krebs cycle, as long as she could memorize the amino acids, she was not just the girl who slept in a stairwell. She was a scientist in training. She was someone with a future. She would not be defined by the concrete floor or the indifferent landlord. Her dignity was not a possession that could be evicted. It was forged in the quiet, relentless effort of her own mind, in the simple, declarative sentence she repeated to herself in the darkest moments. "I am still here." Meanwhile, miles away, in an office that overlooked the entire city, Mr. Takeda accepted a thin file from his subordinate, Sato. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Her name was Annalise Washington. The fluorescent lights of the Student Services office hummed with a weary, bureaucratic drone. Annalise sat on a hard plastic chair, her backpack resting at her feet like a loyal dog. She had waited for 45 minutes to see a woman named Ms. Albright, whose smile was genuine but strained, the expression of someone armed with pamphlets against a tidal wave of need. Annalise explained her situation in the calmest, most detached voice she could manage. She did not cry. She presented it as a logistical problem to be solved. "The emergency housing program is full," Ms. Albright said, her fingers tapping apologetically on a keyboard. "There's a waiting list. It's about 3 months. 3 months. It was a lifetime. Are there any other options? Grants, short-term loans for housing?" Annalise asked, keeping the desperation from her voice. Ms. Albright swiveled back to her screen. "Most of the deadlines for this semester have passed. We could help you fill out the FAFSA for next year to see if your aid package can be adjusted next year." The words hung in the air, absurd and useless. The system was designed for problems that could wait. It had intake forms and processing times and eligibility criteria. It had no mechanism for the immediate, catastrophic failure of a life. "Have you tried reaching out to shelters?" Ms. Albright offered, her voice softening with a pity Annalise did not want. "Or maybe finding a roommate online?" The suggestion was so profoundly disconnected from her reality that Annalise could only nod. To find a roommate, you needed a security deposit. You needed proof of income. You needed a life that wasn't carried in a backpack. She was asking for a lifeline and being handed instructions on how to swim. She thanked Ms. Albright for her time, took the proffered pamphlets on food banks and counseling services, and walked out into the bustling hallway. Students laughed, complained about exams, made plans for the weekend. They were moving in a current of normalcy she was no longer a part of. She was standing on the bank, watching it all rush by. The institutional architecture was its own kind of villain, not with a face or a motive, but with the crushing, impersonal weight of its own procedures. It was a fortress designed to keep trouble out, and she was on the wrong side of the wall. That night, returning to the stairwell, a place that now felt more like a home than any office she had visited that day, she found something new waiting for her on the landing. A bottle of water, still cold, and a small paper bag. Inside the bag was a pastry, a flaky croissant filled with almond paste. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. She stared at it for a long time, suspicion warring with a hunger so deep it was a physical pain. It was a small thing, a bottle of water and a piece of bread. But in the silent, concrete world she now inhabited, it felt like a miracle. Mr. Takeda did not believe in miracles. He believed in information. The file Sato had given him was concise. Annalise Washington, 18. Full academic scholarship to Northgate University, pre-medical track. Current GPA, 40. Orphaned at 16, aged out of the foster care system 6 months ago.
No known family.
The eviction was from a building owned by a man named Arthur Roth of Roth Properties, LLC. Roth owned 17 low-rent apartment buildings in the city, mostly catering to students and low-income families. Mr. Takeda absorbed these facts without comment. He looked at the single, grainy photograph of Annalise from her student ID, a serious young woman with intelligent eyes who was not smiling for the camera. He slid the file across his expansive mahogany desk to Sato, a younger man whose sharp suit and sharper haircut belied a fierce loyalty. Roth Properties, Mr. Takeda said, his voice quiet. I want to know its bones, Sato nodded. Consider it done. The counter-mobilization had begun. It was not a declaration of war. It was a quiet inquiry, a gathering of threads. Mr. Takeda's power did not derive from brute force, but from an intimate understanding of the city's hidden architecture, the complex network of favors, debts, regulations, and oversights that formed the true foundation of every structure. He knew which inspectors could be influenced, which permits had been rushed, which tax filings contained convenient omissions. He was a student of systems, just like Annalise, though his subject was power, not biochemistry. He did not see a victim in the stairwell. He saw a variable in an unbalanced equation. The system had failed her, and his nature abhorred such inefficiency. The water and the pastry were a simple act, a placeholder, a way of saying, "You have been seen." He did not want her gratitude. He wanted to observe her reaction. When David reported the next morning that the items were gone and the space was left, as always, immaculate, Mr. Takeda felt a flicker of something that resembled satisfaction. The girl had dignity. She had discipline. She was worth the investment. That evening, he gave a new instruction. A thick, wool blanket, military grade, gray and unassuming, was to be purchased. It was to be folded and left in the same spot. A small, incremental upgrade. A test. Annalise saw the blanket and froze. It was laid out, perfectly folded, exactly where she normally placed her foil sheet. It was thick, heavy wool, the kind that promised real warmth. This was different from the pastry. Food could be an impulsive act of charity. This blanket was deliberate. It implied a future, an expectation that she would be back again tonight and the night after. Someone knew her routine. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Was it the security guard? Was this a kindness or a warning? She looked around the empty stairwell, her senses on high alert, listening for any sound beyond the building's low hum. Nothing. For 10 minutes, she stood there, her mind racing through possibilities. This was a place of profound vulnerability. Someone was watching her, someone who knew she slept here, alone, in the dark. But the alternative was the November cold, the hard benches of the 24-hour bus station, the constant threat of real danger. This stairwell, for all its hardness, was safe. It was clean. It was anonymous. She made a decision. Slowly, she unfolded her own foil blanket and laid it carefully on top of the wool one, a barrier between the unknown kindness and herself. It was a compromise, an acceptance of the gift without fully surrendering to it. As she settled down, the retained heat from the wool began to seep upwards, a gentle, pervasive warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. It was a dangerous feeling. It was close to comfort. In his office, Sato placed a second file on Mr. Takeda's desk. This one was thicker. Roth Properties, Sato announced. The report was methodical. A history of cutting corners on maintenance. Multiple unresolved tenant complaints filed with the city. A pattern of evicting students just before the end of a semester, when they were most vulnerable and least likely to fight. More importantly, Sato had cross-referenced property tax records with shell corporations and found significant discrepancies. Mr. Roth was not just a callous landlord, he was a cheat. Mr. Takeda read through the summary, his expression unchanged. He tapped a single page detailing a series of fire code violations, faulty smoke detectors, blocked emergency exits, in the very building where Annalise had lived. This one, he said, his finger resting on the violation number. This is the fulcrum. He looked up at Sato. Arrange a meeting with Mr. Roth. Here. Tomorrow. Arthur Roth walked into the conference room with the easy confidence of a man who believed rules were for other people. The room was on the 45th floor, a space of minimalist furniture and maximum view, and he felt he belonged there. He had been summoned for a meeting about a potential investment in one of his properties, a lucrative offer he was eager to entertain. He saw two men waiting for him. One was a young, sharp-looking Japanese man in a perfect suit. The other, older, sat at the head of the long glass table, his back to the panoramic window. The city skyline framed him like a portrait of power. Mr. Roth, the older man said, gesturing to a chair. Thank you for coming. I am Takeda. Roth shook his hand, noting the man's firm, dry grip. A pleasure. You have an impressive office, Mr. Takeda. Takeda did not smile. It is a functional space. Let us not waste time. We are here to discuss a tenant of yours. Annalise Washington. Roth's face registered a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. This was not about an investment. I'm not sure I understand. That's a private tenant matter. She was evicted for non-payment. Takeda slid a thin file across the glass table. It stopped perfectly in front of Roth. Open it. Roth hesitated, then open the folder. Inside was not a lease agreement, but a detailed list of building code violations for his property at 1420 Elm Street. Pictured were rusted fire escapes, faulty wiring, and black mold. Beside the list was an auditor's summary of his company's tax filings, with several glaring inconsistencies highlighted in red. His confidence began to evaporate, replaced by a cold dread. I don't know what this is, he stammered, his voice suddenly thin. This is harassment, this, Mr. Takeda said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of an anvil, is a structural inefficiency. Your business model relies on the powerlessness of your tenants. A flawed foundation. It is destined to collapse. He leaned forward slightly. Here is what will happen. You will call your office and explain that there has been a clerical error regarding Ms. Washington's tenancy. You will reinstate her lease immediately. You will forgive her outstanding balance. Furthermore, you will reduce her rent to a nominal sum of $100 per month until her university graduation, at which point it will revert to market rate. In exchange for this operational adjustment, this file and all its contents will cease to exist. Roth stared at the documents, then at the unblinking eyes of the man across the table. He saw no anger, no malice. He saw something far more terrifying: absolute certainty. This wasn't a negotiation. It was the delivery of a verdict. Every predatory shortcut, every deferred repair, every time he'd gambled on a tenant's inability to fight back had led him to this glass table, cornered by a man who had turned his own negligence into a weapon against him. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the city far below. Roth was a bully who operated on leverage, and for the first time, he found himself with none. He could fight this, he supposed. Hire lawyers. But the information in that file was not just damaging, it was ruinous. It was the kind of meticulously gathered evidence that didn't just lead to fines, but to criminal investigations. The kind that could dismantle his entire shabby empire. He thought of the quiet power of this man, Takeda, who had summoned him here, who knew the intimate details of his business, who had somehow connected it all to a single evicted student. Why? Roth finally managed to ask, the word barely a whisper. Why her? Mr. Takeda leaned back in his chair, the skyline of the city he commanded visible over his shoulder. He considered the question for a moment, as if it were a genuine philosophical inquiry. Because the world is a series of interconnected systems, he said, his voice even. A weakness in one part compromises the integrity of the whole. She is a student of biochemistry. She understands this. You, a student of profit, do not. You have become a weakness in the system. I am merely correcting it. He gestured to the phone on the conference table. Make the call. Roth picked up the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. He dialed his office manager. Annalise was in the university library, trying to study, when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Hello. Is this Annalise Washington? A harried voice asked. This is Sandra from Roth Properties. We're calling to apologize. There seems to have been a major misunderstanding with your account. Annalise stood up, walking between the silent stacks of books. A misunderstanding? Yes, a clerical error. Your account is, in fact, paid in full. Your lease is active. You can pick up your keys this afternoon. We are so sorry for the inconvenience. The line went dead. Annalise stood motionless in the aisle, the phone still pressed to her ear. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. But the word keys echoed in her mind, a note of impossible hope. The key felt unfamiliar in her hand, the metal cold and real. When it slid into the lock of her old apartment door and turned, the sound of the tumblers falling into place was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it, only now it was silent and empty, stripped of the few belongings that had made it hers. But it was hers again. The air was stale, but it was her air to breathe. The floor was dusty, but it was her floor to walk on. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, sliding down to the floor. And for the first time since the eviction notice had appeared, she cried. It was not a cry of sadness or despair, but of a release so profound it shook her entire body. It was the shattering of weeks of tension, the collapse of the dam she had built to hold back her fear. She cried for the cold nights on the concrete, for the humiliation of washing in a public restroom, for the gnawing, constant anxiety that had become her shadow. When the tears finally subsided, a deep quiet settled over her. She stood up and walked through the small space. She ran her hand along the empty kitchen counter. She looked out the window at the familiar, unglamorous view of the brick wall of the next building. It was paradise. The next day, after her classes, she took a bus to a discount store. With the last of her cash, she bought not food, but a small terracotta pot and a packet of basil seeds. Back in her apartment, she filled the pot with soil from a small park nearby. She planted the seeds with the focus of a surgeon, placing them in the dark earth. She set the pot on the windowsill, the one place that got a few hours of afternoon sun. It was a small, hopeful act, an investment in the future, a declaration that she was no longer living hour to hour, but was planting roots. Later that evening, she found a plain white envelope had been slipped under her door. There was no return address. Inside, there was no note, only a gift card to a high-end grocery store. The balance was for $1,000. Annalise stared at it, her heart pounding. She knew. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew it was connected to the phone call, to the keys, to the sudden, inexplicable reversal of her fortune. It was from the same person who had left the water, the pastry, the blanket. A silent, unseen benefactor who had not just offered her charity, but had somehow given her back her life. You do not always see the architecture of a good deed. It is often built in silence, far from the sight of its impact. The meeting in the glass tower, the meticulously compiled files, the quiet, leveraged threat, These were the hidden foundations of a pot of basil growing on a windowsill. Annalise would never know the full story. She would never meet Mr. Takeda. She would only know the result, that at the moment her world had completely collapsed, an invisible hand had reached out and set it right. Mr. Takeda stood at his office window, looking down at the city lights, a sprawling network of circuits and systems. He was not a good man, not in any conventional sense. The same methods he had used to save Annalise's tenancy, he used to crush his rivals. The same understanding of systemic weakness that allowed him to correct an injustice for her, allowed him to create advantages for himself. He was a force of nature within his own ecosystem, acting according to his own code. His intervention was not born of sentimentality. It was a matter of principle. He believed in order, in potential, in the elegant machinery of a system working as it should. A brilliant student forced to sleep in a stairwell because of a greedy, inefficient landlord was a flaw in the design. A bug in the code. He had simply debugged it. This is where the story usually ends, with the quiet resolution, the small act of healing. But this is actually where it begins. You see a person sleeping in a stairwell, a bus station, a library. You see them, and your mind supplies a narrative. A story of bad choices, of addiction, of failure. It is a simple story, and it asks nothing of you. It allows you to walk on. But what if the story is more complex? What if it is a story of a system that is ruthlessly efficient at punishment and tragically inefficient at prevention? What if it is a story about a landlord's greed, a university's bureaucracy, a society that mistakes bad luck for bad character? What happens when one person, with the power to do so, decides that this particular flaw in the code is unacceptable? They do not do it for applause. They do it because they see the inefficiency. They see the waste of human potential. They act not as a hero, but as an engineer. The truest measure of power is not the ability to command, but the precision with which you can mend. It is the quiet, uncelebrated choice to rebalance a broken equation. To see a life thrown into chaos and to deploy your resources, not with charity but with strategy, to restore it to its proper course. We are all part of a system. What inefficiency do you see? And what is your power to correct it?